today we're going to talk about salt, particularly as it's related to canning. Now, in general, we recommend canning and pickling salt if you're doing canning because of the ingredient content in it. It's pure salt pretty much. But there's a variety of others, and once in a while you'll be in a situation where you cannot get the canning and pickling salt. Either it's not available in your area, or it's too far to the store, so what are your alternatives? And in order to figure out what is the best alternative, we need to talk a little bit about them and look at them a little bit more closely. Now you can see the canning and pickling salt is a really fine grain. All salt's going to be little crystals, little cubes, and so it's going to be very similar in size. This one's table salt. This one is probably a little bit finer than the canning and pickling salt. But the big difference is what else is in this one. And it depends on whether or not you're using an iodized salt, which we recommend for most things that you're using at home, so that should be the one that you're most apt to have at home, or whether you've got just a regular table salt like this one is. Now, in many cases, you'll find, in addition to the salt that's in there, you'll also find dextrose, which helps protect the calcium silicate or whatever other ingredient is added in order to make it pour when it rains, so that it's an anti-caking agent, it doesn't clump up. Canning and pickling salt does not have that, so that very often you'll find that when you come back to use it the next year, no matter how well you've packaged it, it's turned into a big chunk, and you have to hammer it or bang on it in order to get enough to measure off. Now, if it's not calcium silicate that's in the salt, you may find something called yellow prussiate of soda, which is also known as ferrocyanide, and they call it the first name because they don't want you to know that it's got a cyanide base. It's not something to worry about, even though it does have a cyanide in it. The concept of having the cyanide is bound to the iron, which is the ferrous, and your body can't get to it, so it's going to pass through. So it doesn't matter that it's there. It's going to perform its function, and you'll get the benefit without any of the side effects. It's also dose next to poison, and it's such a small amount that you would have to eat a whole lot of salt in order for it to make any kind of difference whatsoever. So that's the benefit. It's also the reason you'll also find the calcium silicate in place, so that because people tend to panic when they hear it's there. So those are those two types. Now the problem with the anti-caking ingredients is that they can make the pickles or the potatoes or the green beans cloudy because it settles out. And one of the signs of spoilage is cloudiness, and so then you don't know, is it because I use the salt I used, or is it because of the ingredient in the salt? And that's one of the reasons the canning and pickling salt doesn't have that, and so you don't have to worry if it's cloudy, you've done something wrong and you don't want to eat it. So that's one of the benefits. The other problem with having this is iodine. If you do have iodine in it, it can cause darkening of some ingredients. You probably remember an experiment somewhere in grade school back in the day where you used iodine to make a potato dark. And that same thing will happen in your canned goods. So that's the primary reasons why you don't want to use this one. Now, if you can't use this one, another ingredient that a lot of people have is kosher salt. And if you look here, you can see that kosher salt crystals are substantially larger than the other two we have. And that becomes the issue here. It's also pure salt, just like the canning and pickling salt, but the crystal size is a lot larger, and so you need to compensate for that. So I've got a little experiment over here. We'll get the scale going, and if possible, when you do this, do it in grams because it'll give you a much more accurate reading. So we'll put that on, we'll zero that out, and then this is a third of a cup, a level third of a cup of table salt. Okay, so a third of a cup of table salt weighs 103 grams. Now we want to see what the difference is between that and kosher salt, because if we're going to use equal amounts of kosher salt, we need to know that it weighs the same amount. So let's see what happens when we do that. We're losing a few crystals, but not enough to make up for that amount of difference. So in order to get up to the point where we would need to be at 103 grams, we're going to have to add substantially more salt to that. So let's see what happens when we go ahead and add more salt, and exactly how much more salt we'll have to add in order to get up where we need to be. A little bit too far, but you can see it's quite a bit more. So if you're going to make the substitution, you need to do it by weight, not by measure. Otherwise, you're not going to have enough salt. Now, if you're making a canned vegetable, no problem. You don't need any salt if you're just doing a canned vegetable. If you don't have the canning or pickling salt, your best choice there, just leave the salt out and add some salt later on when you're ready to eat it. If, however, you're doing a quick pack pickle, it's going to impact the texture as well as the flavor. So we'd like to have the salt in there, and you could substitute it, but you need to do it by weight, not by measure. This thing that gets even more complex and more critical is if you're making a fermented or a brine pickle or product food, whether it be meat or sauerkraut or brine pickles, you need to have the exact amount of salt there to make sure that the friendly bacteria, the lactic acid bacteria, their growth is promoted, and they produce the acid that you need in order to correctly produce that food and safely produce that food. If you are leaving it out by not putting enough in because you substituted kosher salt, then you're more apt to have spoilage and possibly foodborne illness if you didn't notice the spoilage first. So the amount of salt you use is very critical. Now, if you look at the other salt that I have here that would be an option that some people would use, what might be sea salt. And you can see here, again, large crystals. So you could make that substitution, but you'd have to do it by weight, not by volume. The other problem with sea salt is it has more, they're all in small amounts, but it has more of some minerals, so it can change the flavor. And it may also have some problem with discoloration because there may be some iodine in there, as there is in some of the others, or some other minerals that will cause some discoloration. The last salt that I have is one that you will not use, and that's rock salt. It's not an edible salt. It has a lot of impurities. We use it to make ice cream and maybe to melt some ice on the street if you don't have salt for melting ice on the street specifically for that purpose. It'll do it for you, but it's not for eating. So those are the basics of canning salt. You can make substitutions if you have to. Choose a pure salt like kosher salt. It's going to be preferred over table salt. Table salt will work if it's not iodized. You're going to have to preferably use the canning and pickling salt, but there are some options out there for you. For Oklahoma Gardening, this is Barbara Brown.
We hope you enjoyed this video. It's part of our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. You can also find even more videos on our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel. And join us on social media for great gardening tips, photos, and discussion.